All right, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Again, I think you all already know me, Mike Bastow with Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. And today we are meeting to have our fruit set meeting for the Champlain Valley. Um, we have a great list of speakers joining us today. We'll be hearing about thinning from Dr. Robinson, then also discussing pest management options with Dr. Anna Wallace, Dr. Scott Casaboom, and Dr. Andres Antolines. So this meeting is also being recorded, so if you'd like to refer back to it later, we'll have that available. I'm also going to be summarizing up the thinning recommendations later this evening. So we should expect to see that in a link sometime tomorrow morning in our e-alert. So we'll have that available for you as well. There's a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. Please be sure that your microphone is muted and that your video is off during the presentations. It's just a little distracting for the presenters, and it's a great way for us to reserve our bandwidth too. So that would be most appreciated through the meeting. I do anticipate though that we will have ample opportunity for getting questions answered though. So if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, or once the presenter is done speaking, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask directly, since we do have a smaller group with us today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off and just talk about what I've been seeing in the orchards around Peru this morning. So I visited a couple of different farms. Oh, before I do that, I would just like to once again thank Valent for sponsoring these meetings. We greatly appreciate the support. So with that, a couple of observations from looking around Peru this morning. I've been seeing really big differences in the amount of fruit that are still on the trees. And a big player in that has been what we were using as our bloom thinner or our petal fall thinner this season, and when we got those on. So it seems to me that blocks that received ATS with the pollen to growth model this year, it seemed like those applications were fairly efficacious for us. Really were able to reduce the amount of fruit load that are on those trees quite a bit, more so than the blocks that we treated with NAA at bloom. Then I'd say as well, depending on when you got your petal fall thinner on, if you got it on a little bit earlier when we had that heat last Wednesday, I think that probably led to a little bit more thinning. If you got it on later in the week, Friday, Saturday, as we were starting to come out of that deficit, you probably are going to have a little bit more fruit left on the trees. I think for those applications that did go on Friday or Saturday, with it only being Tuesday today, we still have a few more days before we see the full effects of those applications as well. So when you did get your petal fall on later last week, I think we're still going to want to wait a little bit to really see how that plays out. And as we get later in this week, we'll be able to make those decisions how we want to work with our thinners. So keeping in mind that I just had a couple of blocks to look at, your mileage may vary, but I did want to break things down by variety as to what I've been seeing so far. So looking at Honeycrisp to start, I think some of the blocks that received ATS at bloom probably don't need much additional thinning at this point. The top still might have a couple of laterals that are still hanging out, but by and large throughout the trees, I think we're getting pretty close from those applications. I think blocks that didn't use ATS, still certainly a couple more laterals still hanging on. I think the 12 millimeter application is still going to be an important one for us in those areas. Looking at Gala, being Gala, not too surprising there. I think a lot of these blocks are still going to need some thinning. It looks to me like the laterals are still set pretty heavily in the Gala that I looked at today. Looking at New York 1 or Snapdragon, again, similar story there. If they got ATS at bloom, I don't think much additional thinning is going to be required. I think they're getting fairly close. Again, maybe a little bit at the top's a little heavy, but I think we can clean a lot of that up with hand thinning. Those without ATS are still set up with a lot of laterals. Those are going to be needing a 12 millimeter application. Looking at some Mac blocks, mostly looking at Ruby Mac and Linden Macs today. Some laterals there are still hanging out, 2s and 3s, so I think they're going to need that 12 millimeter application. Then looking at Cortland's, even where we saw that early king damage, I think in a lot of the blocks that I was looking at, there's still a decent amount of laterals on there, still seeing 3s and 4s in some blocks. So, those laterals are set up pretty heavily, and I think those blocks are going to require a thinner at 12 millimeter. Then looking at some McCown, again, if you use ATS on them, I think they're fairly close. Again, maybe a little heavy at the top still, but not a ton. And then other blocks that had NAA at bloom, I think we still need some additional thinning, even though they were hit a little bit harder by that frost. I still think we still have laterals that are still growing pretty nicely and certainly could use that 12 millimeter application. So overall, quite a bit of variability from what we saw in terms of cold damage, in terms of what thinning's already been done at this point. Certainly there are some blocks that are certainly going to require that 12 millimeter application though. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Robinson.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with you today. Can you see the screen fine, Mike? As long as I put it in presentation mode?
Yep, looking good, Terrence. Thanks.
Okay. Wow, what a tale of many different situations. Appreciate, Mike, your diligence to look around and sort of drawing these conclusions about where we applied blossom sprays and petal fall sprays. It's a challenge because of the frost. Some people chose to defer any decision until later, till they could see the fruit. But now we find ourselves in a difficult to thin situation with no carbohydrate deficit. Others went ahead, thinned at bloom, thinned at petal fall, and maybe don't need to do anything at this stage. So it's always a gamble. If you defer, you might end up in a box. And that's a little bit where we're at right now if you haven't done any thinning yet. I want to emphasize that this is sort of the third step in a multi-spray program. It's really usually the most important spray. But I will hasten to add, last year, because of carbohydrate surpluses, no deficit, we didn't get much thinning from many of the sprays at 12 millimeters in Western New York. And this year in the Champlain Valley, we're looking at that kind of same scenario of relatively high carbohydrate surpluses. So I'll give you my thoughts, but I'm a little bit pessimistic we're going to be able to thin really hard right now if we need it. So as I summarize what I'm sort of picking up from hearing Mike and thinking about the weather is that widespread frost damage gave very variable damage depending on location. But in general, we had pretty decent pollination weather and pretty good fruit set. And even those blocks that seemed like they had lost a lot of the kings seem to have come through with a pretty decent crop. Now, the big bugaboo for me is that petal fall spray went on under relatively warm conditions with a significant carbohydrate deficit. Now, that is if you sprayed in the early part of last week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Those sprays that went on in those days, I think probably gave excellent thinning and almost finished the job. If your petal fall spray went on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're just now beginning to see the results of that. But by that time, the carbohydrate deficit had disappeared, and those sprays will have given only modest thinning. Now, the bad news that I'm giving today is that the spray we're facing this week will go on under relatively cool conditions and with no carbohydrate deficit, and will likely give only modest thinning. Now, we suggest you time this spray coming up on the degree day calculator in the carbohydrate model, somewhere between 250 degree days. Now, I've said that repeatedly for a bunch of years now, and I found myself this year in a problem because some growers took it too literally. And in Western New York, some sprayed in that window, but under intense carbohydrate deficits, and we've gotten some overthinning. So it's a suggested range. You can go beyond the 250 degree days. You have to find the kind of weather window that will work the best. If you go up to 300 degree days, then you're really into this rescue thinning phase, and most normal thinning cocktail mixes won't work. But I just throw that out. Don't be so tied into this range that you ignore warning signs like we had with the heat. Now, we're not facing that anymore. We're facing a completely different situation. So this is what the carbohydrate balance looks like for Peru that I ran earlier today. I put Bloom somewhere around, I don't know, May 15th or 16th. Petal fall sprays last week. But in the early part of that petal fall window, we were facing a massive carbohydrate deficit of around minus 35 average, close to minus 40. That spray will have worked beautifully. But if you went to the later time of that window, on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, then we were facing almost no deficit, and it will have worked much less. Then if you look at the window that I've blocked out for this week's spray, which started on Sunday and goes through Thursday, it's all a surplus of carbohydrates, and not just a little surplus, but 30-gram surplus. That's a big surplus, which will make it extremely difficult to convince the tree to shed some fruit. Now, I wanted to point out in the actual table at the bottom, I wanted to illustrate a couple of things. One is, this is for the dates that I picked for a green tip date. I can't remember right now, somewhere around April 6th and the full bloom date around May 16th. But it shows that we're entering the window with those little boxes around the degree days. We already entered it on Sunday, and then it will continue through Thursday, stretch it to Friday, stretch it to Saturday. But in those days, we're not looking at any carbohydrate deficit. But what I want to point out is what happened last week on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. We had daily deficits close to this minus 60 threshold that I say be careful about. When you averaged it out over the 6-day average in the next column, no particular day was more negative than the minus 35 on May 20th. But I don't think many people put out petal fall sprays that earlier, but they could have put them out on May 21st or 22nd and 23rd. And with the deficit we've had there, they should have worked wonderful. Now, it was, in a way, a blessing that you had temperatures that didn't exceed 88, no 90s. You didn't have extreme deficits like Western New York, particularly Wayne County had in that same time period of minus 100 grams. But nevertheless, those 3 days of minus 58, minus 52, minus 41, 3 days pieced together of those deficits give what I call a natural thinning event. The tree will start to drop some fruits naturally just because of 3 days of deficit. And we've proven that with the shading studies where we impose an artificial shade to get that level of deficit. We always get fruits dropping naturally without any thinner. So when that natural drop event on May 21st, 22nd, and 23rd happened, chemical thinners on top of that often result in just really great thinning, or in some cases over thinning. Now, on the positive side, with this sort of negative message I'm giving, thinners do have a stronger effect at this 12 millimeter timing and are more effective, and they can be risky with large deficits, but we don't have that this year. We have this carbohydrate surplus period in the next few days. And so even though this is the time period when we get the maximum response from chemical thinners, I predict it's going to give us a modest response. But I emphasize again that natural severe carbohydrate deficit last week gave us a natural thinning event. Thus, maybe many blocks only need modest thinning. This will require you to make a really good assessment of where we are in the thinning process. I'm going to show some slides in a minute about a little bit of data in Western New York because I don't have that fruit diameter measurements in the Champlain. But let me first cover what are our options at the 12 millimeter. If you listen to what Mike said about blocks where he thinks additional thinning is required, or blocks that didn't get a blossom ATS and or didn't get a petal fall spray during the heat, and thus are going to need a significant amount of thinner this year. Now, almost all gala, both in Champlain Valley, Hudson Valley, Western New York, will need a substantial dose of Maxell at the 12 millimeter stage. Given the lack of carbohydrate deficit, I'm suggesting you'd go for the full dose on gala. Now, my recommendation is 64 ounces on a tree roll volume dilute basis. That's a half a gallon per 100 on a tree roll volume dilute basis. In the next slide, I'm going to review how to calculate how much actually goes in the sprayer. With Honeycrisp, it was interesting that Mike said that many blocks appeared like they had pretty much have gotten all the thinning done when they had 2 shots of ATS and a pedal fall thinner. So you may consider not putting any more thinner on Honeycrisp. That's a decision you have to make looking carefully. If you were cautious and didn't put on earlier thinning sprays and you have a strong set of Honeycrisp, then I would suggest 3 ounces of NAA plus carbaryl to go on at this 12 millimeter, especially since we have no deficit to help us. For McIntosh, I think is what Mike indicated. There's a little more thinning needed, a more modest rate of 2 ounces of NAA plus a pint of 7. Empire probably is going to need a substantial dose if it didn't have thinning earlier in the season. And the few Fujis that are there will need Maxell because we don't like to put NAA on Fujis. I've reviewed this last time we met at the pedal fall spray, but I just fear that there may be somebody new and or people didn't understand me before. To make sure you have the right amount in the tank, you have to calculate tree roll volume of each block. And then calculate what we call the concentration factor. That's simply the tree roll volume divided by the amount of water you're spraying per acre. Most growers do not spray full dilute. I don't know of any grower that does. So what typically happens on a high density orchard, let's say, or even a medium density orchard, it might have a tree roll volume of 200 gallons for a dilute spray. Most growers are going to spray 100 or less. Let's just choose 100. Therefore, the concentration factor is 200 divided by 100 is equal to 2. Therefore, you have to take the rates that I suggested, and we'll use for this discussion, let's just talk about that gala rate I gave you, the 64 ounces of Maxell. You have to multiply it by 2 because we're only putting on half the water we should. So that's a full gallon of Maxell per every 100 in your spray tank. If you have a 500-gallon sprayer, that's going to be 5 gallons of Maxell in a spray tank. Now, some growers are spraying substantially less than 100 gallons. Let's suppose you're only spraying 50 gallons, a 4X type of thing. Then you're going to need to have a concentration factor of 4. And so the amount of gallons in one spray tank would be more than the 5 gallons because you're covering more than 5 acres. Now, typically, I don't like to use the concentration factor adjustment for 7 or carbaryl or surfactants, but this year, because of the carbohydrate surplus you're facing, I would say go ahead and concentrate the 7 and concentrate the surfactant. Or use the surfactant, not concentrate the surfactant. Now, based upon the carbohydrate model and the dates that I use for green tip and full bloom, it looks like this window for carbohydrate for 12 millimeter thinning opened on Sunday and will go through Thursday. But again, that's just based on degree days. Friday probably is okay and Saturday is probably okay. The problem is your carbohydrate situation is not going to improve very much. If you spray today, tomorrow, today and tomorrow, the temperatures are predicted to be in the 60s. They'll warm up by the end of the week, but both cases, we have a surplus carbohydrate balance. And therefore, my message to you today is you've got to use a full rate. Now, where you had excellent thinning achieved from your bloom and petal fall sprays, you could be all set and not need any additional thinning at this 12 millimeter timing. And that's very unusual, but it's a result of good temperatures in bloom and then good temperatures at that petal fall timing. But with Gala, regardless of what you did earlier, I would say almost any block I've ever looked at needs this 12 millimeter spray. I still think you have to go to each block and assess the block. Yeah, I just left in this stuff about assessing king bloom, but really at this stage, it's more assessing how many laterals you feel are still growing and whether the king is present. If the king is present, it should be substantially bigger than the laterals. And if it's supposedly 13, 14 millimeters, but the laterals are still under 10, that size difference between the king and the laterals will often mean that those laterals will be quite sensitive to thinner and will come off. But if the king is missing and all the laterals are about the same size and they're all 12 millimeters, that's going to be a difficult to thin situation. And so you would need to really determine how many kings are there and how many laterals, and if there's big size difference between the kings and the laterals. Now for this spray, typically we want to nozzle so that we're putting 75% of the spray in the top half of the tree. If you sprayed at petal fall, I'm predicting that the lower part of the tree will be almost perfect and will need only just a little extra thinning. And if you nozzle so that you put a full dose on the lower half of the tree, you'll be disappointed with little fruit left in the bottom. Now let's comment briefly about Regulate. I've put out these two rules in years where there's no carbohydrate deficit, you should include Regulate, and in years where there is a carbohydrate deficit, don't include Regulate. Well, this is a year where the surplus of carbohydrates is so big that I would add Regulate to all of the sprays that have NAA. Now, Regulate doesn't seem to help Maxell and 7 sprays very much. What does help them is some oil, but Regulate will really increase the effectiveness of NAA if you need that. But as Mike indicated, where we use a lot of NAA on Max and on Honeycrisp probably don't need all that much, and the Max only need a little bit, so maybe it's not that important of a point. But if you have a really strong set variety where you're going to use NAA, I would add the Regulate to it. I don't have this fruit growth rate data for the Champlain Valley, but I want to show you a little bit of a challenging situation that came from heat at the petal fall spray. This is from an Orleans County Honeycrisp orchard in which we've been measuring fruit diameters. And you can see that the first little blue vertical bar on the 22nd of May indicated that we still had 174 fruits that were growing and we wanted to be down to 70. Now we started with almost 700, so the bloom and the petal fall, the two ATSs and the petal fall spray did reduce that substantially from 700 down to 174. But we still had 100 more apples than we wanted per tree. But the troubling thing is that petal fall spray went on the previous week, that the Champlain ones went on right before the heat. And the heat by itself, without any additional thinner, took it from 174 fruits down to 104 fruits, and then continued knocking fruits off so that this morning when they were measured, there was only 63 fruits left on the tree and the target was 70. So this is the point that severe carbohydrate deficit was a natural thinning event, and you've got to see what that gives you before you go out with a 12 millimeter spray. You can start to try to see that now, but it might be a day or two more before you can really tell. But where you can tell is laterals that don't seem like they've grown very much. They still are hanging around at 8 or 9 millimeters. They're falling off. They're in the process of it falling off. And even it may look like they're stuck on pretty good right now, they're not going to make it. And so I would hope that this little experience here with, yes, that petal fall thinner we thought thinned pretty good, and we were ready to go with more thinner, but we did not. And naturally, because of the heat, we got this additional thinning. I just remind you, because I don't think we're going to have a 16 millimeter rescue thinning meeting. I don't think it's necessary this year. I think everybody will finish their thinning right now at the 12 millimeter. But I do want to remind you that 16, 17, 18 millimeter fruit size is what we suggest. You start a low dose of ethereal in that spray, and then you can spray every 10 days after that, a full dose of ethereal. The full dose of ethereal is 1 pint to the acre or 5 pints in a sprayer. Do not really put that level of dose on until the fruits get to 25 millimeters. So if you start at 16 millimeters, then you're going to be at this half dose rate of a half a pint per 100. And then the later ones, which will be later in June, we're all at the full dose of 1 pint to the acre. So I concluded what I wanted to say today and I'd love to discuss it with you. I'm going to summarize that I think some blocks are done. We don't need any more. But Gala in particular, maybe McCowan's that didn't get early sprays, or Cortland's that seem to come through better, probably still need a 12 millimeter spray. The carbohydrate balance is not conducive to good aggressive thinning, so you'll have to use full rates. And hopefully it'll give you enough to get you down to close to the target. So with that, Mike, I'll conclude and be happy to talk about it more for the next few minutes.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Terrence. We do have a question in the chat box from Jim. Can LI 700 be substituted for the Regulate?
Yes, it can, and it's a little bit more potent than Regulate. And because of that, I often don't want to suggest it. But if in this particular year with that carbohydrate surplus, first of all, I have to say, if it really pans out, because some of this is forecasted, but if it really pans out the way it looks on the graph so far, I think LI 700 would do a great job of helping.
All right, thank you. Are there other questions for Terrence? While people are thinking about additional questions, I would like to ask.
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've got a quick question. I didn't want to write it because it's complicated.
All good, Dan, go for it.
Dan, Hicks Orchard. Block of Honeycrisp trees, about 150 gallon tree row volume on B9. Mature trees, and I had already 2 shots of thinner, one at early petal fall, right on the 20th, so right at the end of that hot spell. I think I've got about 40% king damage. What I'm looking, and I did a second shot boosting the NAA rate on the 25th, so over the weekend. I'm still seeing very strong laterals. Where I've got single kings, they're about 16 millimeters. Where I've got groups of laterals, they're all about 10 to 12 millimeters now. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm surprised at that a little bit, because that earlier spray during the heat on the 20th should have taken off a lot more. And so, Dan, you're further south in the Champlain Valley, but I would have expected you to start to see now a significant response from that heat.
It's hard for me to tell the differentiation between kings and laterals, because it's such a mixed block where they, the laterals are all that's left. They are all pretty evenly growing, and so I can't really tell whether they are weakening at all. They seem pretty tight on the trees. I am seeing some thinning, but it's just not enough.
Yeah. And you say that the biggest kings are now, or the biggest fruits are about 16?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have just a few more days, 2 to 3 more days to come back and spray those again. Unfortunately, it's not a conducive window. I don't know if you put Regulate in before, but what I would do is spray not a high dose of NA, but not a low dose either. I would spray the 3 ounces of NA, but I would add Regulate or LI 700 with it.
Yeah.
And the
I've been ambivalent about, or curious about the NAA, because it recommends now pretty clearly state don't use any adjuvant with thinner, but I know that there are exceptions to that. So again, on 150 gallon trees, I'm looking at 4.5 ounces per acre, and then some Regulate.
Absolutely.
Okay. and do that sooner rather than later. All right.
Yes, because I don't think waiting, you're going to get any better weather window in terms of carbohydrate balance, but the fruits start moving out of any sensitivity to thinner at all.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
We had a question from Jesse. In this weather, would you still not recommend exceeding a 2-time concentration for larger trees if they are 250-gallon plus trees?
Okay, so Jesse, I'm just trying to understand your question because we talk a lot about a 2x concentration, but that's not the limit. We are okay with up to 4x. So let's just say the 250-gallon is, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I'll talk, and if I didn't get it, you'd correct me. If your trees are 250 gallons, a 2x would be spray 125 gallons. But a 4x would be spraying a fourth of the water of 250, which would be about 62 gallons per acre. We're okay with that. Or a 3x, a third of 250, which would be somewhere around 80 gallons to the acre. So all of those 2, 3, or 4x are okay for thinners as long as you're calculating it correctly. What people get into trouble sometimes is they spray 60 gallons and assume that the rate I give of 3 ounces per 100 and 60 gallons is going to work. It does not work without the concentration factor. Okay, so the next comment Jesse made is that I'm on the right idea, but in some better thinning years, we've talked about concentrating too high. That is true. We feel very confident in 2x and 3x. We feel pretty confident in 4x, but some people will go on big trees 5 or 6x, and that scares the willies out of me because there's so many possibilities of having an error and getting the wrong response. And Jesse's saying exactly right. When you get up in those concentration levels, you put a lot of NAA in one take, and it's kind of scary. So I particularly like 2x and 3x. I kind of not that warm about 4x, but 2x and 3x is lots of people do that. If 250-gallon trees at 3x, that's 80 gallons to the acre, works beautifully.
All right, thank you, Terrence. We had another question from Jim. I think going along those same lines about, larger trees. Larger trees like M7, in your experience, do they tend to thin easier? We've kind of heard that being passed around as sort of anecdotal
So
suggestions.
absolutely that is true. And I forget to mention that, but it's something I've often mentioned over the years, but forgot to mention anything today about it. So if we went back to Dan Wilson's B9 trees, they're relatively weak, I would presume. Those are hard to thin, and M9 trees are hard to thin because the tree puts all its resources into fruit, and so you'd have to have some deficit to get the trees thin. But M7 trees often have many more shoots on them, and so those shoots use a lot of carbohydrates. And so it's easier to create this shortage of carbohydrates with chemical thinners in an M7 tree than it is in an M9 tree or a B9 tree or a G11 tree or a G41 tree. So we do suggest less dose on an M7 block, but not a huge amount because this year with a carbohydrate surplus, you're going to need every little bit. So this year I would put a full dose that I suggested on the M7 trees also.
All right, thank you.
I wish it was better news, but it just is so weird the way the weather changes. And, Western New York, we've been battling this excessive carbohydrate balance and overthinning, but now in the Champlain, we're battling the opposite, trying to get enough thinning. But luckily, what Mike said, I think is extremely valuable. Those who went forward with blossom and petal fall thinning are sitting in pretty good shape.
We had another question come through, Terrence. What about shutting off half of my lower nozzles? How does that affect my rate? Would I then be essentially doubling the amount of NAA I'm putting in?
So that's a very good question. You can just shut off. Suppose your bank has 10 nozzles, 5 above and 5 below. Suppose you shut off 3 of the lower ones, leaving only 2 lower ones. You still now have 5 in the top and 2 in the bottom, that's 7. So you have 7/10 of what you had before. So you have to increase the amount of NaA proportionally by dividing by 0.7, but it's not a doubling of the Na. If you completely shut off all the bottom nozzles out of 10 nozzles on a side, so there's only 5 left, then you do have to double the Na to get the same amount of Na out per acre. But it's a pretty simple ratio calculation you learned in 7th grade math. Just the number of nozzles you shut off versus the total. That ratio gives you how much extra Na you have to put in the tank.
All right, thank you, Terrence. Do we have other questions for Terrence? I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but if we do have, these surpluses, Terrence, and people are considering making a 20 millimeter application next week, I don't anticipate we'll have a separate meeting. So just wondering if you wanted to add any comments on that, particularly with Exceed being available now, or other recommendations for that late thinning material.
Absolutely. And so in a way to save us from having to have another meeting, if we get through this week and we have these surpluses, they really pan out like it's showing, and we don't get the thinning we want, it's great that we have one more option middle of next week to come back with specifically this combination, Exceed plus Maxell. Now, I don't see any Valent people on the call, but their labels kind of suggest Exceed by itself. But I've found that it's a very mild thinner and it needs to have Maxell with it. We've tested Exceed and NaA, but NaA at 16 and 18 millimeters is kind of worthless. The tree gets very insensitive to NaA once you're past 16 millimeters. But it still retains some sensitivity to Maxell, and then Exceed really helps. So those two together have been one of the best strategies for rescue thinning when we just don't get what we need out of any of all the other earlier sprays.
Right.
I don't think I would use it on Max. I don't think it's going to be needed on Max, but it could be needed on Galas. It could be needed on Honeycrisp.
All right, thank you, Terrence. I do see Mike Keller on. Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything else you'd like to mention with Exceed? If you're still in front of your computer.
Well, I'll let him correct what they don't like that I say privately. But I've talked to the Valent research people quite a bit about this, and they want to be able to on their label just to say it simple, but they realize that it does better when it's mixed. So this was the same process we went through with Maxell. They originally talked about Maxell by itself, but over the years, we've learned that Maxell works much better when mixed with 7 or Carbaryl. And so now it's our standard. We don't ever spray Maxell without Carbaryl in the mix. And I'm pretty sure that's what we'll end up with Exceed. My suggestion is do that this year. They'll probably say, well, let's wait, see how it works. But that's what's working best in our trials.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Terrence. I think another thing I've heard from Valent is they found it tends to work best under slower drying conditions. So if you do plan on using it this year, doing it evening application, early morning applications, if you're really looking to get the most efficacy out of it, has been their sort of tentative recommendation going into this year. So something to consider.
Okay.
All right. Not seeing any other questions. Thank you, Terrence. If you're able to hang out, maybe people will keep putting some more into the chat box for you.
Apologize, but I have to now finish a little preparations for the Western New York Rescue Thinning meeting, which I have in about a half an hour.
Oh, certainly. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time. Thanks for joining us today.
See you, everybody.
So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our next speaker. Next up, who needs no introduction, we're going to hear from Dr. Anna Wallace, who's going to tell us about some of the IPM resources that she has available for you all.
Thanks, Mike. Just getting my screen up and shared. Can you see that okay?
Yep, looks good. Thanks.
Okay, and thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk, and really sorry that I can't be up there in person. It would be good to see everybody in person. I'm just here today. I know everyone's thinking mostly about thinning, but just a quick reminder about some of the IPM resources and some of the training opportunities that we've been having. There are a lot of pest management decisions that are being made, and so I just want to remind everyone of a few things that are available to help with those things. There are a lot of great guidebooks. I think mostly everyone here is familiar with most of these things, but just to remind you again, or in case there is anybody that hasn't heard of any of these resources, in addition to the Cornell Pest Management Guidelines for tree fruit, I really like this sort of simplified apple IPM for beginners if you're looking for a refresher as an experienced grower, or if you have somebody new on your farm that's getting up to speed on all of the insect and disease pests. This can be a great resource. It starts with a little calendar based on phenology that you can use to sort of guide your thinking about what to be doing at what time of year. It's for free on as a PDF online, and so I've included the link to some of these things here. I can share these slides with you at the end, Mike, or we can just pass around the links in the chat at the end if anybody is interested in any specific resources. In addition to the apple IPM for beginners, there's also a stone fruit IPM for beginners. And I know a few of the people on the call grow some stone fruit. So if you're looking for that, if you're really looking to get into the nitty-gritty of pest identification, this tree fruit field guide that was co-authored by a number of different people at universities across North America collaborated on. This is a really excellent resource for insects, mites, diseases, and natural enemies of tree fruit in North America. And so I really like this when I'm trying to get a good idea on something. You can always send pictures and samples to us. We love to get pictures and help identify things as well. And then if you're more on the organic side of things, this is a little bit out of date. It's a little bit of an older resource. I shouldn't say out of date, but there's still a lot of really good information in it. This Grower's Guide to Organic Apples. And so that's also available as a PDF online as well. And so there's always also the Cornell Tree Fruit website, which has a whole list of different things for tree fruit as well as small fruit available. Oops, I didn't mean to open that. We're going to just move on to the next slide. In addition to those guidebooks and guidelines, there are a few online resources and apps that are available. One of my favorite things is the Apple IPM Intensive Workshop that was recorded a few years ago, but is still a really great resource. It includes these really short videos, 4 to 15 minutes long, on different IPM topics, specific pests, mostly recorded by Dr. Art Agnello, Dr. Garrett Cox, and Dr. Juliet Carroll. Put this all together, covering different insects, diseases, wildlife, and weeds in orchards. There's also a few different apps that are really helpful for identification. So if you haven't seen this My IPM app, this is a really great app where you can download the data for apple diseases and insects, as well as a bunch of other fruits. And you can scroll through pictures that are related to that pest. And then you can see, in addition, some text that is related to the pest, and then some other information. Often there are recordings about management. And so I encourage you to check this out. It can help you pull up a quick gallery to help identify things when you're in the field. And then iNaturalist and LeafSnap are also apps that you can attempt to identify things from. I think mostly these are on the side of plant identification at this point, but we're working to develop things that can identify crop pests as well in this avenue. In addition, if you haven't heard of My Efficient Vineyard, this is kind of a neat tool that was developed out of the Clairol Cornell Research Station for vineyards, but it's applicable to all different kinds of agricultural production. It's an app that you can kind of build yourself. You build your own farm once you create an account, totally for free. And then once you create your farm and you have all of your blocks mapped out, you can also create your own data collectors. So you can decide what the fields are, whether there are specific data points, if you want to upload a picture, if you want to have a GPS coordinate. And so you create that data collector, and then you can walk around your orchard and collect data the way that you'd like to do it. And it all shows up with GPS accuracy. And you can, like I said, keep pictures there as well. I've been using it a little bit in my scouting, sort of playing around to see if it's something that will work for me. I know other people that use it pretty extensively. It has a lot of capabilities that, like I said, have been geared primarily toward grape production, but they're also moving to use it in other forms of agriculture. So I encourage you to check that out if you don't have a way to map your orchard already. Additional training that we've done included a virtual IPM scout training. And so Mike joined me and Janet Van Zorn from Western New York, the Lake Ontario fruit team, for a virtual training where we did our best impersonation of this cute IPM scout, being all prepared in the field. But we, in addition to going over some of the best practices for scouting and monitoring, we went through some specific pests and how you should be trapping for insects in a commercial orchard. So as someone that is getting up to speed on monitoring, this might be a good thing to review. We have the recording on the New York State IPM YouTube channel. And so it's sort of a basic training, but I think it's a nice refresher for somebody that's coming on new that might want to just see how things are done hands-on in the field. So I encourage you to visit that and review that recording. We're also developing a new resource online. It's a monitoring network across New York State for insect pests of commercial orchards. This is a collaboration of people from Extension, as well as industry and growers. And so what I've done is distributed traps for 5 major insect pests across the state. And then people are submitting their own data across the state. And so we can see sort of in real time this map that you can drill down into the data based on the date range, the region, so in Eastern New York or Western New York, a specific location or a specific species. And then this map will change in real time, or the graph, as well as the map will change in real time to display that information. There's also a table at the bottom that shows this information. And in order to protect privacy, these are not specific accurate GPS locations. That would be a little bit sensitive. So we've truncated all the GPS coordinates to make sure we're only showing a approximate township kind of level, with the idea that we want to show regional trends. Often county level data is not quite in line with microclimates that are regional geographies. So these sort of relative points are showing more accurate sort of microclimates across the state. And so it's a little bit clunky, I'll admit at this point, because it's a new tool. But if you're interested in participating in this network, we're always looking for more people to contribute data. We are a little bit past the biofixes for a couple of the insects at this point. And so I have been distributing traps to collaborators, but we're probably behind that for this season. But if you're interested in participating for next season, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Another thing that we've worked on this year, over the winter, I offered an online scouting course. It was a 5-week course that ran Wednesday nights. And we did that in real time. Dr. Carrot Cox, Dr. Monique Rivera, Dr. Andrea Santolinas, who's here today, and several other people joined us to give lectures talking about some of the major insect and disease pests and IPM fundamentals and tools. Again, a good resource, I think, for somebody trying to get started and up to speed on all of the insect and disease pests in apple orchards and scouting, as well as people who would like a refresher. So that was live. You can still take it asynchronously at your own pace. So if you're interested in doing that, you can visit the Small Farms Courses page and do that on your own. We're hoping to offer it again in the coming winter when people have more time to sit down in front of a computer and take a class. And if you don't already know, I think everybody here is pretty familiar with many of these resources, but the Scaffolds podcast, we're continuing to record episodes and share those on a weekly basis. That's being led by Dr. Monique Rivera, and Mike has been great about taking the transcript of that and sharing it in his e-alerts and newsletters, so it can be in both an audio and a written format. While I have a captive audience, I just wanted to give a quick update. I know most people here are just focused on tree fruit and specifically apples, but there are a few people that are diversified into cherries and berries. And so I wanted to just remind folks that we're starting to think about spotted wing Drosophila monitoring. And this pest is typically emerging, the first emergence, between the end of May and the beginning of June. Last year, it was a couple weeks later than average, just because it was kind of a cool and dry spring. This year, with the really early warm temperatures and pretty wet conditions, we're anticipating a pretty early emergence. And so we're starting to put our traps out now. We've been doing experiments, testing different kinds of traps over the past couple of years. And we found that both these jar traps, which were sort of the first trap that was developed and very effective in commercial farms. So this jar trap is very effective, but the sticky cards, the red sticky cards, are equally effective as what we're finding in our work. So both these traps have a scented lure that draws the flies to the trap, and then we're looking at them weekly. And so if you're interested in learning more about monitoring for that insect on your farm, please feel free to reach out to me. I also wanted to announce that we're starting a new blog. So the Spotted Winged Drosophila blog that Juliet Carroll ran for many years really successfully. We are migrating to a new blog, which is for a couple of different reasons. We are going to be monitoring for a few other berry pests. And so this gives us a platform to do that. Surveys over the winter at meetings and on the blog. Growers reported that they had trouble with other pests. And so we're trying to accommodate that and help. It also allows us to port regionally instead of on a county level, which was what was done in the past, just so we can more accurately describe the microclimates like I described before for the apple pest monitoring network. And it also gives us a little bit more efficiency and flexibility on the back end, which hopefully shouldn't be something that you're thinking about, but it makes it easier for us to be more responsive to the industry needs. So if you are already getting the alerts or the alerts from the Spotted Winged Drosophila blog, you should have gotten an alert about a new post trying to migrate to this new blog. So we're just asking everybody to move over to that if they can. In the meantime, during the transition, in an effort to not miss anybody or lose any information, we're going to try to post on both blogs for a little bit. But if you could try to migrate over to that new blog, that's where the most up-to-date information will be. We've also been updating quick guides, both for cherry fruit flies and for Spotted Winged Drosophila. So if you've used these in the past, it's just a quick guide for pesticides that are registered in New York to help you rotate materials really easily. So all the color codes are by the IRAC group to help with resistance management. So that's all I have, just a couple quick reminders about some of the IPM resources. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, I think Scott and Andreas are going to give a better update about specific insect and disease activity. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Anna. Always great to have a reminder about all the wonderful resources we have available to us for IPM management. And you're doing a really fantastic job of curating and keeping all of these loose ends together. So we appreciate the work you're putting into keeping us on task with that. Any questions for Anna before we move on to our next speaker? Well, we'll keep an eye on the chat box for you. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Next up, we're going to be hearing about disease management from Dr. Scott Kossenboom. For those of you that don't know Scott, he joined the lab back in January, I believe. So still relatively new to us in his first growing season here, but we're excited to have him on board as the new pathologist. So Scott, go ahead and let us know what we should be expecting disease-wise.
All right, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here, and yeah, I'm happy to be in this role and working on disease issues. So if I haven't met you, I'd love to meet you sometime. And I think I took a tour of the Champlain region over the winter and got to see a couple of farms, which was really great. So but for today, yeah, I just wanted to give you a quick idea of some of the things that I'm working on for my research. And then secondly, talk a little bit about diseases that might be of concern at this stage in the season. So first off, with the things that I'm working on here for research trials, I'm doing a number of trials with fungicide efficacy. a lot of these center around model using different models for predicting infection from different diseases. So I'm doing model-based trials for rust, for powdery mildew. Those two diseases are not on the NUA website yet. I'm also doing a model trial for bitter rot as well. So excited to see how these models that are already out there in the literature, how well that they can predict infection risk for these different diseases and if they can be effectively utilized. So that's some of the work that I'm working on. Other work is looking at fungicide efficacy for apple scab and cedar apple rust. And then also looking at antibiotic efficacy for blister spot. And so really interested to see alternatives for controlling blister spot. And then lastly, a little side project is on looking into UVC. Kara Cox's lab has shown really good results utilizing UVC for controlling a few different diseases. And we also want to establish that technology out here and start evaluating it for disease control and potentially insect control as well. So yeah, excited about that one. And if you all have any interests or any things that you think are really important, I'm happy to talk with you and sit with you and talk to you about different disease issues. So for now, for this period of the season, we're just coming out of petal fall. Some of you may have a few rat tail blooms left in your orchard. And if you do, then technically those blooms are still susceptible to fire blight. And so those could be sources of more infection and could potentially need to be protected if we have the right weather. And I believe right now, northern New York is in a really high risk for fire blight. So, but once we're out of bloom, then fire blight is not a major concern unless, we have a major weather event. Apple scab is also not quite as big of a concern now, as long as those primary infections were controlled earlier in the season. All those spores that were on the orchard floor have now been released. And if you had an effective control early on in the season, then you should be set in terms of apple scab control. So, but if you have infections already on your trees, those can also lead to secondary infections on other leaves and the fruit as well. So scouting is really important for checking for those primary scab infections. Also looking out for fire blight strikes and pruning those out. And now as we're getting past those diseases like fire blight and apple scab, summer diseases are the next that are coming around the corner. And there's a model for sooty blotch and fly speck on the NUA website. And it utilizes, I believe it's the petal fall timing, as well as your most recent fungicide application to tell you what your risk is. And the general recommendations for sooty blotch and fly speck is, watch this model for when the infection risk gets high. And then once you make a fungicide application, that will set the clock for about 2 weeks or so until you can make the next application. But you can keep on following the model Otherwise, some people tend to do a calendar-based spray program for those diseases. There's some other summer diseases as well, like bitter rot and Marsanina leaf blotch, but I'm not sure if those are, major concerns up in northern New York. I think bitter rot is more of a concern down here in the southern end of the state. So, yeah, I think keeping an eye on that city blotch and fly speck models is a good, will be a good practice, as well as, scouting your fields and looking for any primary infections. Powdery mildew could also continue to be a concern for another few weeks until leaves are mature, and then they should be effectively resistant to that disease. So those are just some things to keep in mind disease-wise, and happy to answer any questions anyone has. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Scott. We do have a question from Dan in the chat box. We talked about this a little bit last week in the capital region too. So on fire blight, we talked at length about how most of the local suppliers are out of strep at this point, and Casuman is only rated up through petal fall. So do you have any suggestions on what people can be using at this point, where they might still have a little bit of rat tail bloom, or they might be past that but are concerned about shoot blight?
Yeah, so I would recommend double nickel. Strep is our go-to, but when it's out, there are a few things that are effective. Carrot Cox has done some work with some biological and biorational products, double nickel being one of the best that he found. You can also look at his study and look at how effective those were. But I believe double nickel was a good option there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. I think I saw double nickel, and I think double nickel and Quava together could be a potential option too. Would that be
Right.
all right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's correct. Mhm.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Scott? I did have a question for you. I'm getting some reports, not from the Champlain Valley yet, but from the western parts of the Mohawk Valley, where we're in similar phenology. A couple blocks are starting to see some signs of Marsanina, some signs of frog eye leaf spot. Do you expect we're going to see symptoms of these diseases earlier this year, like some of the other insects that we've been having, where possibly just because it was a warmer winter that these things are showing up earlier? Is this something that we should be on the lookout for, vigilant for, think about with our upcoming fungicide sprays?
Yeah, I think we should be keeping an eye out for those diseases. I would expect them to also develop up there. Yeah, we've also been seeing a lot of frog eye leaf spot down here in the Hudson Valley. And so I would expect it to be up there as well. So I think the fungus that causes frog eye leaf spot tends to be susceptible to Captan, which is a commonly used fungicide at this point and for the rest of the season. So keeping on a good schedule with that product, as well as using site-specific fungicides when the disease pressure is high, like at about an inch of rain or more. Those are good times to proactively prevent those infections with those site-specific products.
Okay, great. Thank you. I also wanted to, not to throw another wrench in there, but Terrence had mentioned that with some of these upcoming thinning sprays, we might be thinking about adding in these penetrants. We don't like to put that on around Captan. So if we're
Yes.
leaving Captan out of the tank, would you recommend going in with those single sites for this week protection?
I think it's a good idea. If the risk, if it's looking pretty hot and dry, you can probably go with a biological or biorational product because the disease pressure is low. But if the disease pressure is high and you're right around this thinning period, then yeah, I would not recommend Captan at this time. We're also getting to the point where the PHI for mancozeb is too long, And a lot of some labels say don't spray after, after bloom. So then, yeah, you're kind of left with site specifics for biologicals.
All right, great, thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Next, we're gonna turn things over to our new entomologist at the lab, Dr. Andres Antolines, who's gonna be giving us an update on our pest management in this post-petal fall timing. So Andres, you are good to go.
Thank you, Mike. I'm gonna share my screen. Are
Looks
you
good.
looking the presentation now?
Yep.
Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I apologize for not being there in person. Definitely, I will try to go more to the Hudson Valley. That's an area that I really like, and I really like the apples there. So I will try to go to the Champlain Valley more frequently. Today, I will talk about some of the key insects to have in mind in this time of the year. So I will start with probably one of the kind of complicated to manage, Plum curculio. So Plum curculio typically colonize the apple orchard in the spring when temperatures are between 55 and 60 Fahrenheit. And this is an insect that has nocturnal habits. So the oviposition of the insects regularly start at petal fall when the evenings are warm. So when the evenings are above 60 Fahrenheit, that's when the insect is more active laying eggs on the crop. In this season, I have seen high damage in untreated orchards in the highland area. So it looks like the populations are high. And remember that to control Plum curculio, you need to protect your crop from petal fall to the end of the oviposition period. And the key here is to know how long that oviposition period is. So in order to know how long the oviposition period is going to be, you can use a model. So you can use, for example, the NUA model. So if you go to the NUA model, you need to enter the biofix that in this case is going to be the petal fall date. So remember, you protect your crop from petal fall until you reach 308 days. And why 308 days? Because that's when the model assumes that the insect stops migrating to the orchard. So you don't need further applications further than 308 days. Options for control Plum curculio. You can control Plum curculio using different products from different groups of insecticides. So you can use a Bond, you can use Actara or Imidan, or you can also use diamides. You can use, for example, Exirel or Verdeprine. Let's talk about a group of insects that is the Lepidopteran complex. So we have oriental fruit moth, codling moth, and oblique banded leaf roller. So let's start with oriental fruit moth. The first capture of oriental fruit moth was around May 13 in the area of Peru. And oriental fruit moth typically starts laying eggs between 50 and 70 degree days after the biofix, which is the first capture in your pheromone traps. And remember that the target for application is between 350 and 375 degree days. And usually that window of application coincides with the petal fall application. So if you do a petal fall application, you can target oriental fruit moth and Plum curculio at the same time. For oriental fruit moth control, you can use Altacor, Abond, Delegate, or Warrior 2. You can also use premixes, for example, Boolean Flexi, or you can use Besige. And you also have the option of a mating disruption. There are combos between oriental fruit moth and codling moth, so you can use the isomate combo or the sidetrack combo. Both work very well. If you use the isomate combo, that combo also provides protection against lesser apple worm. And about codling moth, the first capture of codling moth was in May 21 in the area of Peru. So according to that, right now we are around 129-degree days. So possibly the application window is going to be next week. Remember that you target the first generation larva of codling moth between 220 and 250 degree days. And that is usually between 6 to 14 days after the biofix. And for effective control, you have to apply 2 times, and you apply the second time between 10 days to 14 days after the first application. Options for control codling moth, you can use Altacore, Avant, Exirel, or Assail. However, for Assail, I recommend to save Assail for the second generation because you can also target apple maggot. Or you can use organic options, for example, Entrust, or you can use the Cirex virus. Oblique-banded leaf roller, this is an insect that we haven't seen this season, at least in the Hudson Valley area or in the Champlain Valley area. There is a report of oblique in the Geneva area. And the first flight of oblique is typically in June. And there is also a second flight in August. The control time, the control window for oblique-banded leaf roller is between 360 and 450-degree days. And to control, you can use product space on Bacillus thuringiensis, for example, Javelin. You can also use Entrust or premixes such as Besich, Boleam, or Minectopro. Next insect is San Jose scale. I have seen an increase in activity of San Jose scale recently. Remember, San Jose scale has sometimes 3 generations and under some conditions just 2. So the first generation appears around June. The second one between late July and early August. And if there is a third one, it's in late October or early November. And if you're going to control San Jose scale, there are 2 different windows of application. One pre-bloom application and one after petal fall. If you do your pre-bloom application, you're going to target this overwintering stage, the black cap stage that we see here in this image. And if you do an after petal fall application, you're going to target the crawler stage that we can see in this part of the image. Recommendations to time your sprays after petal fall. Basically, it is suggested to monitor. So you can monitor by doing 2 things. You can monitor by placing pheromone traps. So with the pheromone traps, what you do is that you capture the males when they start flying. And once you capture the males, you can set your biofix, that is going to be the first flight. And then you can apply insecticides between 400 and 450-degree days after the biofix, which is the first male flight. Another option you have in order to do monitoring is to use electrical tape on the branches. So using electrical tape on the branches, you're going to be able to see the crawler emergence. So once you start seeing the crawlers in the tape, you can time your application. Options for control, pre-bloom applications, you can use an oil application or you can apply steam or Centaur. Both are insect growth regulators. And if you choose, or if you have to do an after petal fall application, one of the options is Movento. And you can also apply Besich or Venerate. Last insect, and this is an insect that I have seen a lot this season. The activity of woolly apple aphid this season has been hyped. There are different reports of woolly apple aphid in the state of New York. And those reports are early reports of woolly apple aphid. Actually, there is a report of woolly apple aphid in March, which is unusual. So right now, one of the questions that I have is if those early appearances of the woolly apple aphid are going to end up in more severe infestations. We don't know that yet, but we started the project with the help of different collaborators across the state in order to evaluate those infestation levels of the woolly apple aphid. So we are going to be sampling in the Mid and South Hudson Valley, also in the Champlain Valley, and also in the Lake Ontario area. So at the end of the season, we will be able to know how aggressive it was and where are the spots where the insect is more aggressive. And also, one of the secondary objectives that we have in this study is to monitor the populations of the parasitoid of the woolly apple aphid, Aphelinus mali. It's a tiny parasitic wasp. So we're going to monitor the populations in order to see what's the state of the natural populations of the natural controller of this insect. Options for control woolly apple aphid, if you need to use a chemical in order to control, you have also two application windows, basically a pre-blue application and an after petal fall application. So for pre-bloom, you can use Cefina, which is a new product, but for best results, if you apply Cefina, you need to apply Cefina as soon as you start seeing the colonies. That's when the product is going to be more effective. Options for after petal fall applications, Movento always works well if you apply between first and second cover. Remember that Movento takes time to start working, so between 7 or 15 days in order to start seeing the results. And there is the option of diazinon that provides excellent control. However, this is a very aggressive chemical, and I recommend only using diazinon in very extreme cases. To finish, I would like to take your attention about this insect, the spotted lanternfly. This is an invasive insect right now in the United States. It's in the New York State, and the populations are very high, close to New York City. But in the last seasons, we have seen that the insect is like going more north and north. Right now, we have spotted lanternfly in the Hudson Valley, in like very big populations in the southern counties. So if in counties such as Orange County or Ulster County, we have very big infestations, and I have seen also infestation points almost until the capital region. So it looks like the insect is going north. Right now, there is a report close to the Adirondack Park. So it's going in the direction of the Champlain Valley. The insect has different stages. So the first stage, and actually the stage where the insect overwinters is this stage, the egg mass. And May, July, the first instars start hatching. They start appearing. And between the first instar to the third instar, the insect is black with these very cool white dots. And then between July and September, the fourth instar appear. The fourth instar, it's red and black with these white dots. And then after the fourth instar, the adult appear. The adult is very mobile and can fly. It's not a very good flyer, but can fly around 100 meters. So this insect moves a lot, and it can go to different kinds of trees. The favorite tree of this insect is the tree of heaven, but it can also go to black walnut, it can go to red maple, it can go to black locust, it can go also to apples. But it looks like in apples, it doesn't cause significant damage. So at least for apples, I think that if the population is not huge and if there is not a lot of sooty mold, probably apples are going to be fine. However, I think that also for people for orchards that have U-pick, it could be a problem because maybe can deter people from visiting the orchard if there is an infestation close to the orchard when they are trying to pick apples. So right now we started a project in order to monitor the populations of spotted lanternfly, and also in order to try to stop the spread. So if you see this insect around, you can contact me. Here there is my email. So let me know if you see either the adults, the eggs, or the nymphs. And I think that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Andres. Are there any questions for Andres? Andres, I do have a question for you. We are seeing more and more of the apple leaf curling midge here in the Champlain Valley. I was wondering if you have experience with that one, or if so, what recommendations you have for managing that in blocks where we're starting to see more of it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with that pest, but I have heard that Cefina and Sivanto may work well. But I don't have data in order to support this,
Okay, that's good to know. I also just digging around. It looks like Exeril has a 2 label for it. Do you know of efficacy with Exeril on it?
No, I haven't seen reports for Mitch. No, I haven't seen reports.
Okay. All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right,
Mike,
well, with that,
this is Phil Murdoch, Chapin Orchard. I got a quick question on
sure thing,
this.
Phil.
The spotted lanternfly. Is there an effective spray against it?
Yeah, in terms of chemicals, actually, spotted lanternfly is sensitive to a lot of insecticides. So you can use pyrethroids, you can use dinotefuran, and the insect is very sensitive. I have seen the results of the efficacy test, and the majority of commercial insecticides have almost, close to 100% of success. The problem with the lanternfly is not like the insect is not resistant to any insecticide. The problem is the huge populations they have. And also one of the problems is that it's an insect that comes from the forest. So if you have a very high infestation close to your trees, it is going to be very difficult to control because you cannot spray the whole forest. So if the insect arrives to your crop, you can control the insect with pyrethroids, for example. But the problem is the quantity of the insects that are going to keep coming into your orchard.
All right, thank you, Andres. I wanted to follow up with you on something else too. You mentioned Safina and Versus. It looks like that's in the recommends as well for woolies. Have you had experience of efficacy with them on woolies?
Yeah, actually, we did a study. I think that was 2023, and we try Sivanto, Cefina, Movento, and they all have good results, but the key for those compounds is timing. So if you let the population grow, there is a point where even though you apply a good insecticides, you're not gonna have good control. So always the key is to have good timing. So as soon as you start seeing the colonies forming the wool, you should apply. If you pass that time, probably the only option is in order to have complete control, is diacetyl.
All right, good to know. And just to follow up on that, working with Andres on one of his projects this year, we are scouting around and we are seeing some colonies in Peru particularly in Cortland's, they seem to be hanging out there and some Galo blocks too. So definitely now's the time to get out and scout around for them and think about making those applications in a timely manner.
Yeah, I was talking to a grower this morning and he told me that he has been using Belief. And it looks like Belief kind of slow down the infestation levels, but doesn't kill completely the insect. So it's always matter of timing and how can you keep the populations low.
Sure, certainly. All right, well, if there's any last minute questions for any of our presenters, please go ahead and shout them out or type them into the chat box. While you're thinking about them, I do just want to make a couple of announcements because I'm completely shameless and need to advertise things when I get the chance. So just a quick note to mark your calendars. We do have some meetings that'll be coming up over the next couple of months that you might want to be thinking about. Here in Peru, we're going to be having a perennial weed management workshop on June 21st. That's going to be in the morning from 9 to 11:30. We'll be starting over at Northern Orchard and then working our way over to Hearts. We'll be looking at some of my research plots that we have on dealing with a couple of our really problematic perennials like bindweeds, thistles, and grasses. So if you're able to join us that morning, we'd be happy to have you. We're going to have a sprayer calibration workshop down in Columbia County, so a little bit of a drive, but that's coming up on July 9th. We're going to have George Hamilton again for that one. So if you missed it last time, that was in Peru. You have another opportunity to catch him there. And then another opportunity that I wanted to let folks know about is July 17th and 18th. It's actually going to be up in Quebec. They're doing what they call the Great Apple Tour, and they're really going to be focusing a lot of those talks on orchard mechanization and labor efficiency. So I think a lot of topics that are of interest to the group. And I've been assured by my counterparts in Quebec that they will be translating into English for us. So it's a totally free tour. It includes busing to the various orchard stops and food for the day. I'm planning to just carpool each day. It's not that far away. You just meet at the hotel each morning. So if that's of interest to you, I'll be getting more info out on that one as well as we get closer to July. And I'm sure we'll probably have a few more meetings here and there throughout the summer. So just a couple of ones to keep on the radar. So with that, we're getting close to 4:30. I think we'll go ahead and end for the day. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And thank you to all of our speakers for hopping on Zoom and taking the time out of a busy post Memorial Day weekend day back at the office for joining us. So we'll be getting this recording up and the blog post out in the next day or two. So we'll get all that info to you shortly. Thanks.